Breathing is the most efficient and useful tool on the planet, and the least used.
Welcome to a brand new episode of Starts at the Top, our podcast about leading differently. I'm Paul Thomas.
And I'm Zoe Amma. Our podcast exists to help leaders and their teams understand what they need to do differently today to prepare for the world of tomorrow. We started Starts at the Top as a podcast about digital disruption, but we soon realised that leaders were telling us about something more important and urgent, about how traditional ways of leading had changed forever.
We make it our mission to speak to leaders, and luckily we spoke to this leader way before I got this cold. Who are carving out new ways of leading, and we cover topics from emerging tech to inclusion, from remote work to mental health and climate change, basically all the subjects that today's leaders need to be across in 2024.
And this isn't about shiny corporate case studies, it's about lessons learned and progress made the hard way, and crucially, how that can inspire others.
And in this episode, we're sharing our conversation with Alina Addison, author of a new book called The Audacity Spectrum, Leading with Care, Courage and Non-Conformity. Alina is also the founder of Adaptaa, a leading executive coaching and leadership development company, and she has over 20 years of management and leadership experience.
We've had copies of Alina's book for several weeks now and have both really enjoyed reading it. But before we get onto our chat with Alina, I wanted to touch on an article that you found, Paul, on the BBC website today that highlights concerns we've talked about in past episodes. And that is the steady decline in focus and funding for diversity and EDI-focused projects and programmes. Whilst we've heard about the impact this is having inside workplaces, this article focuses on declining funding for groups supporting women in STEM, science, technology, engineering and maths, such as Ada Lovelace Day, the global annual celebration of women working in STEM, and even former Starts at the Top guest Maggie Philbin's Teen Tech. And we loved talking to Maggie back in 2021, so do check out that episode. We'll pop that in the show notes too. So thank you, Paul, for sharing this article. I thought it was so interesting and it really, really resonated with a lot of the things we've talked about in previous episodes. For example, this sense of EDI being deprioritised and to some extent being defunded, or certainly funding for it being cut significantly. And I'm thinking back to some of our previous guests and the challenges they outlined around the economy being really in a really challenging place, especially with cost of living, and how that has meant that some organisations are not investing in that area, which I think is a real shame. And the article also outlines how some of these groups are just kind of running on goodwill, really. And there are these very short-term funding cycles or short-term donations, which can't, by their very nature, solve some of these very systemic embedded issues, which is obviously about the lack of women and the lack of diversity in tech, which I think is a major issue for our society. What are your thoughts, Paul?
Well, it's something we come across all the time, isn't it? And I know you've been quite passionate about the instances where you've been asked to come in and talk to someone or talk at an event, and being either the only woman on the panel or seen a severe lack of women participating. And as we've just been discussing, and apologies for my voice again at the moment, I'm suffering from a bit of a cold, but we've just been discussing before we came on the fact that this sort of, as you said, it's almost like a funnel, isn't it, that ends up with these big tech organizations, and many organizations, but the tech ones in particular, with a big lack of women in positions of leadership and power within the organizations. But if you track it back, it goes all the way back to the choices girls and women are making at school and university and college, and what people feel is available to them. And I saw a quote online that literally said that one of the big challenges is that STEM subjects are seen as a subject for boys, which is quite a shock to me that I reading that. And I think that's part of the challenge, right? If young girls aren't being inspired to take up the subjects at GCSE level, they're not going to then take them through to university. and therefore not going to be able to get into those types of careers in the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's some really boring stats in this article. So it talks about how, so this is looking at the data from UCAS, the UK University Admission Service, that there's 12,000 men going into computer science, but 3,000 women. So real disparity there. And then if we look at how that then feeds into the tech workforce, so in 2023, 34% of Google's global workforce were women, 32% of its leadership team, and at Microsoft, 29% of executive roles were occupied by women. So some really significant headroom there to make the workforce in these big tech companies more diverse. And you only have to look around the room, don't you, when you go to a tech event. And I see this in the tech for good space as well. I don't think things are necessarily any better. I'm so used to being quite often the only woman or the only person of colour, sometimes both. And we have to act on this challenge as a society. And employers in the tech workspace really need to start making it a priority again. Otherwise, it's not going to change. And this inequity is going to get coded into all these new AI tools that are being developed very rapidly, and are only going to develop even more rapidly over the next decade.
Yeah, and I think it's true. Even in my day-to-day working life, I do see the people that are working on EDI initiatives within organisations are having to shout increasingly loudly to even make sure that it remains not remains on the budget. I think there's still, certainly with the organisations I work with, still a recognition that it is important and it needs to be funded. But with everything else that's going on, it does slip down the pecking order, and it just can't be allowed to do so. So yeah, I think there is a challenge there. And we said we wouldn't give Elon Musk any more airtime on this podcast, but there was the quote included in the article from him saying that EDI is just another word for racism, which is a real worry, isn't it? That people in influential positions are seeing it in that way.
It doesn't even make any sense.
It doesn't make any sense, but thank goodness for people like Tim Cook at Apple, who says there's absolutely no good excuses for the lack of women in tech. One thing we haven't got in here is the numbers from Apple. So if we manage to find those to see what the percentage is and whether Tim Cook can speak from a position of authority because Apple's doing a better job or not, we can try and find out and share in the show notes. But it's certainly that challenge that we discussed, the funnel approach. It gets smaller and smaller and narrower and narrower. Is it any wonder that it's not being made a priority higher up the top of that funnel in schools, in organisations, and in young women's lives?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been really interesting seeing my daughter joining secondary school, which some listeners will remember she did very recently, and seeing how her school approaches STEM as opposed to my son's school. He's a boys' school, where I think they've invested quite significantly in STEM and the teaching STEM. I think in my daughter's school, they have done some really good stuff in that area as well. But already there's a bit of a sense that it perhaps is a bit more of a priority in the boys' school compared to the girls' school. And you can see how this stuff then starts so early at the age of 11 onwards, where if you're getting this messaging and seeing that it's more of a priority for boys, no wonder you might start to get an impression that it's not for you.
Yeah, I think that's it, isn't it? It's not for you. Is the message that seems to be coming through in all of this. So yeah, we'll share the link in the show notes. We'll do our best to find out some more stats and things, maybe point people in other directions of articles that back it up. But it's worrying times.
Worrying times, but we should try and get some guests on who have made progress in that area.
Definitely. So now for our interview with Alina Addison.
We are super excited to welcome Alina Addison to Starts at the Top. She is the founder of Adaptaa, a trailblazing executive coaching and leadership development company, and she has over 20 years of management and leadership experience. She serves on the board of several charities and is the co-owner of a family-built and run hotel in Transylvania. Alina lives in London with her family, and she's the author of a new book, The Audacity Spectrum, Leading with Care, Courage and Non-Conformity. Welcome to the podcast, Alina. We're so happy to have you here.
Thank you so much, Zoe and Paul. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And we loved reading the book. It's so interesting, and it really chimes with a lot of the conversations about leadership, which we have on this podcast. We'd love to hear about why you wrote it and what inspired you.
Thank you. And actually, before that, I wanted to acknowledge that your podcast about leading with difference, it really resonated so much. When I listened to some of your podcasts and your mission about, really teaching people to lead differently, this traditional model of leadership, which is becoming so outdated. So thank you for that. But for me, to answer your question as to why the book, well, my motto is sharing is caring. That's how I lead my life. That's how I lead my team. And it was really coming from a dare. Like a lot of the things I've done in my life, they've started with a dare, including the hotel that you mentioned. It was purely a dare around a dinner table. Could we do something like this? And the book was similar in many ways. Could I just write a book, which seemed like an impossible task 5 years ago when the idea came about? And it was a conversation with a good friend of mine, and she was in the middle of writing a book. And I always say everything happens through people. Everything happens through conversations. And I had this niggling thought of, why not? Which is how I also lead with the question of why not. And the real true inspiration for my book, it's actually my son, who wrote his own book at the age of 13. And so that was 7 years ago. He's now 20. And it's still unpublished. It's still in a drawer. And it was very much anchored in a big event, in a big life trauma at the time. And for him, he just wrote for 3 months nonstop. And 2 years later, I came up with this idea of writing my own book, which became a different book from the actual idea inception. It started as a personal, as a memoir, and then it transitioned into this leadership book. So it's got a tiny bit of the personal, but most of that's gone. Maybe it's another book.
It's brilliant. And I love that focus on why not, and that being the cornerstone of leading. And yeah, that's very much something which resonates with the most amazing leaders I've ever worked with. And speaking of that point about focusing on that why not approach to leadership, in the book, you describe how leaders are told they are too much or not enough quite often. And that's also something which really resonates with what I hear from leaders. Whereas your why not statement, I love that because it's very liberating. It's very freeing. What is the impact, do you think, on leaders when they're constantly hearing that mantra of being too much or not being enough?
Well, I mean, it's devastating, I would say, to use a very big word. But the reason why I also titled the book Spectrum is because we are all on sort of the spectrum of too much or not enough. And actually, it's the too much and not enough tends to be two sides of the same coin. Because when you are told you are, for example, too demanding, let's say, in the workplace, or too intense, or too nice, all of those things, you then end up thinking you're not enough of the other side of it. You're too nice. It's an example of a client that I worked with a few years ago, which meant that he felt he is not assertive enough. He is not firm enough. So it really is, it creates this narrative of insufficiency, of we are lacking something. And this is really one of the messages in the book, is that we have to own who we are with our strengths and our weaknesses. And I tend to not use the word weakness as much as I can. It's almost like gaps, because we all have our superpowers, as I like to call them. And yes, we all have the things that we maybe don't enjoy as much. We're not as good at those. And in the leadership world, is surely there will be someone else out there who we can delegate to, or we can maybe learn from. And yes, so I think my real passion is to work with leaders to get them to own that uniqueness, get them to own who they are, whether it is too much or not enough, because most of these things start with a good intention. So, too persevering, it could be, it's construed as maybe obsessive nature, yeah, or too too demanding, again, would be someone who it can be construed as aggressive, just too high standards for the rest of the team to catch up with. So it's really understanding who we are and what our preferences are, and yes, toning it down to some degree without losing our authenticity, our uniqueness, who we really are in the world.
I'm so pleased you've called this out, because now we're so unpacking it. It's really bad practice in feedback, isn't it? Because it's very defining. It very much assumes that someone is a fixed thing. They're very much defined by their characteristics and they can't evolve. And there's no yes and, is there? So your thing about your client who is too nice, in inverted commas, that's actually a very nice, good quality as a leader, isn't it? To be kind. And where's the build on that? The thing of, well, actually, maybe, you're very kind and maybe there's something you can do to have more boundaries and, protect yourself from burnout. So something where you're giving the feedback really constructively and positively. It's awful that there's this bad practice around, isn't it? Particularly when I think good leaders are continuously evolving and forming, aren't they?
Totally. And I love that sort of concept of and, you're too nice, let's call it in inverted commas, too. And how can you then channel that in a way that serves you and the people? And yes, at some point, what I say, when our superpowers go into overdrive, because we all have our superpowers, they do tend to become weaknesses. And it's almost like a self-defense mechanism. So someone who is too nice, to use that, on the spectrum, and we stretch it to each side, they might find it difficult to deal with underperformance, for example. They might find it difficult to deal with some, behavior maybe in the team because they're too nice, because they are not willing to have a difficult conversation, because they are, they don't want to hurt someone else's feelings. And I always say, just where is that coming from? The too nice. Is it coming from a place of fear, i.e. not being willing to have the difficult conversations? Or is it coming from a place of love, which is, that kindness that you're allowing someone else, maybe not to underperform, but do it in a kind way? So it's finding that balance. It's a real difficult dance in a way, but we all do. If it does go into overdrive, if we're too nice consistently without being firm, sometimes boundaries, I think is the word that you use, without having some strict boundaries in place, then yes, we could trip behind that line, and it's a way of how do we then come back in a sweet zone, I call it. I used to call it the sweet spot, but I realized that there isn't a spot. We all have, your spot is different than mine, and it's just a zone. Where is this sort of zone of dance, as I call it, where we can all try to find it for each and every one of us.
Really like the way you frame that. And then thinking about where leaders go next with their development, I really love the 8 principles that you've outlined in the book for effective leadership. Are there perhaps 2 or 3 of them which really resonate with you?
Well, that's the most difficult question, Zoe, because of course I chose 8 because I love them all. So actually, to say which is my favorite, and depends on the context, of course. It's all contextualized, and so I think for your listeners, there are 8 A's of Audacity, or 8 A's of what I call audacious leadership, because they all start with the letter A. And I'll just tell you a little side story to this. So when I had this audacious idea, I call it sort of crazy ideas, to have the book with the most A's in it, with the letter A. And I even just went to my publisher and I said, what do you think? And of course they said, that's silly, Alina. And they allowed me to keep my A's for my the beginning of each chapter. And, it became a star. It became like an Audacity star and a North Star. And it's an apex. So if you look at each star apex, it's an A effectively. So we sort of played it. It wasn't meant to be that way, but I always say in life, it's everything is meant to be in a way that we never really expected. But to go back to your question, so the 8 A's are sort of the attunement, which is the power to slow down and really to feel your feelings and tune into other people's feelings. Then you have the acknowledgement, which is this courage to know is your strengths, but especially your weaknesses, and actually embrace them equally, because they both part of us. The third one is the assurance, which is this confidence to say yes. The assertiveness, which is the fortitude to say no. The fifth one is the authenticity, which is this sort of self-trust, self-belief in a way that you care less about what other people think. That's what an authentic person does. Then you have advocacy, which is this passion to care so much about a mission, about someone, about something that you move mountains. Number 7 is adaptability, which is the courage to let go, really just change the plans. And the final one, the 8th one, is the appreciation, which is this resilience to be grateful even in the most difficult moments, actually especially in those difficult moments. So I love them all. Your question is any particular one? So I think they will really resonate differently with different people, and it's a spectrum. My invitation in the book is to look at each and every one and see which is the one that you want to play with. Which one is your superpower, and which one is what I call in my language an edge. So, and maybe one of the things to mention is at the end of the book, in the very last chapter, there is a quiz and it's also available online. So I'd love for the listeners to buy the book, okay, obviously to get it in the last chapter, but it's also available free online. So you don't have to have the book to do the quiz. And the quiz will tell you which one of these 8 is your superpower and which one is your edge, because we will have different scores. And so you could literally go to any of those chapters and start with that. When I wrote the book, that was one of the intentions, is you don't have to, it's not linear. I started with this idea of a spectrum being a linear spectrum, and I realized there's no such thing. There's no straight line in life. And it's a circular, which is why it became a circular star, which means you can start with the end, you could start with the middle, you could start wherever. But possibly, I think for any leaders, my favorite ones would be, well, I will say always start with the end, like Stephen Covey, one of my most favorite authors of all times. And so appreciation. If you appreciate, who you've got in your life and what you have, it's easier then to do other things. And then the learning how to say yes and how to say no. So those chapters, 4 and 5, the assurance and the assertiveness. So I will probably start there and then go in other places, but because most of the time a lot of us will find it easier to say yes or easier to say no. We are leading from a place, and so I lead with the why not, which means the assurance part is my it's my apex. I go into overdrive with yes and forget to say no. And so that's my dance. So I don't know whether that answers your question, but that's probably where I will pick those 3.
No, it does. And thank you. That's such a good overview of those principles and how they all fit together, and also where leaders might begin with those. And you mentioned authenticity, and I absolutely loved your description of authenticity. And I'm just going to read it out because I underlined that page, stuck a post-it in it. It really spoke to me. So you describe authenticity as owning up to who you are now and who you want to be or become later, and setting an intention to become that person. And that really hit home with me, and it especially hit home with me because authenticity and leadership is something that's been talked about so much, hasn't it? Especially since the pandemic. Can you tell us more about how leaders can be truly authentic?
It's interesting you picked that particular chapter, which I didn't mention. I find that a really difficult concept of truly authentic, because when your use of word truly, it's very telling. So the authenticity chapter starts with true or false. That's my rhetorical question to the reader, because it's very hard. Authenticity is probably the hardest as a human being. I'm not even saying about leaders. Generally, as human beings, to be truthful in a way, truthful to ourselves and truthful to others, because we have been so conditioned to be careful about the other person's feelings, and to not hurt their feelings, or to or care about what they think, care about being validated, being right. Being right is a big driver. What happens if I'm wrong? What happens if I look stupid? It's the judgment. The fear of being judged is paralyzing for most humans, which is what stops us from being authentic, from being truthful. And so that's not an easy job to, and people say, can an authenticity be learned? When we've been so conditioned to be, and untruthful, actually, and that's with good intentions. And I talk about in the book about the white lies, and we just want to save the feelings of the other person. And there's a big difference culturally as well. If you look, in the as an English British, which I'm not, by the way, but I'm surrounded by them at home and everywhere else. We have this being considerate and being diplomat, and being very careful with what we can and cannot say. Then you go to US and they're much more direct, or to Germany. In Asia it's completely the opposite. So it's a very interesting dynamic as to the narrative that we have been conditioned to believe as to what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. And then that's where what's authentic for you may not be authentic for someone else. And the authenticity bit, I genuinely learned it from my son. And again, for your listeners' benefit, so my son has been diagnosed to be on the spectrum, on the autistic spectrum, at the age of 10. So that was 10 years ago, which is why he's been a big inspiration, and he's a main sort of character, because he's been my biggest teacher and my biggest student. And he is an example, or used to, because he's actually learned a lot more of the social conventions. But he used to be someone who will take authenticity to the extreme. And when you are 5 or 6 or 7, and then you make a comment on someone's appearance, for example, it's cute enough. But when you're 20, that's no longer acceptable. And it's truthful. He will make a comment about someone, and I don't think I've used that example in the book. But when we were in a restaurant and he made a comment on the waiter, appearance. I think the waiter had earrings, and he made an loud, but in for him it was just curiosity. Oh wow! And I remember kicking him under the table. And that was the worst thing. That was such a big lesson that I learned in that moment, because of course he went into, but that's true. And it was true. And yet there is the social convention that we've learned as to, even if it's true, how does that land? How is that making the other person feel? So we are now, we're having to consider. And this is where I think some of the conflict and the complications and the complexity of life is, because we make a story as how would you feel? And then I won't have the courage to say it. How would Paul feel if I tell him something? Or how would Zoe? And then most of the time, that story that we're telling ourselves is not true, because we don't know how the other person is feeling or will feel. And that's stopping us. It's a lot of the barriers, if you like, that we're putting into being truly authentic, to your point.
It's funny, isn't it? Because for the longest time, and I think it's still true today, but certainly back when I was full-time in offices and working with teams, there was this sort of sense, and I think everyone has their own view on this, but you're a different person in the office, or you're a different person at work than you are at home. And I think that still rings true a bit. People sort of dial up elements of their personality. For me, I'm fairly reserved, and I wouldn't say introverted, but reserved and quite quiet. In an office context, I'm the opposite. I will come out of that and I will play up to probably the more extrovert elements of my personality. And I think there's been something in that has been challenged somewhat through lockdown and through the COVID era, that we are our more authentic selves, because we are giving, like today, a window into each other's worlds through a screen. You're able to see me in my son's bedroom. I'm able to see you in your wallpaper library. Zoe's in her room. We can see into each other's worlds, so we start to bring a different perspective. And I just wonder how that has shifted over time. So that authenticity is possibly more present today than it was maybe 5 years ago.
No, 100%, without a shadow of a doubt. And I think this is where we start interpreting it, because we haven't got the tools to, how do we apply it in a way that remains authentic? As you said, we have choices. Do we, as you said, I choose to be more reserved at home, and then I've learned the behavior to be more, extroverted in a way, as you said, at work, because we are adapting. And that was that chapter. We're sort of adapting to each other environments, to each other's styles. And I think that's what we've learned. I mean, authenticity is one part of it. And we have to be, again, careful. That's why care is such a big part of my book. When most people know, or audacity or audaciousness for the boldness, for the courage. And my invitation is I'm introducing this extra element of care, which is a different dimension that people would not think audacity is associated with care. And yet, in my view, it's 100%. That's a very important ingredient. And therefore, we are learning to care about the other person and their style and their preferences. We are becoming much more aware of differences. And then, and for me, I had to learn it the hard way, which is probably the most wonderful way in a way. But to this extent that my son was so different from who I was, and we were at these two sides of the spectrum to such an extent that we had to learn to accommodate each other, if you like, and we learn from each other. So I learned to be more like him, and he's learned to be more like me, and we're just evolving. It's part of the evolution, as you said, and but it is becoming more acceptable, as you said, to intertwine the personal with the professional. And there is also, there are still some places in the way that I work in the corporate world where it's still totally unacceptable. Although we talk about it, I think it's still not that welcome. Rightly or wrongly, it's like you keep home, and then work is work, and there is a big divide between. But there's a lot of encouragement. The sort of new leadership wave is encouraging a lot more. And I think the new generation is more willing to have more fluidity between the home and work, actually.
Yeah, I definitely think that's right. There's certainly a shift, isn't there, between younger people coming into the office and the expectation that they have, the expectation that they have in themselves and what they can bring to the work environment, but then the knock-on effect of the expectation that then brings to the leaders they work with, that they expect more from leaders that quite possibly need to read your book and haven't quite got their heads around, or how do I need to adapt to the new world of work? Because the younger generation will be taking over imminently. One of the big conversations with the clients I work with is succession and succession planning. And if the new generation is almost a complete polar opposite to the generation that's in charge at the moment, then there's going to be a shift.
No, absolutely. I love that. And actually, that's a really interesting, as you said, the succession, and how do you bring the conversation at the table with the traditional, conventional, old style of doing things with this, what I call the non-conforming, more non-traditional, more unconventional, and try to find a sort of hybrid in between, because neither one is good or bad. It's what is. We just have to learn different ways of doing things.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you talked about caring as well. And obviously that's a key part of the approach that you outlined to leadership, which you really loved. And I particularly like the chapter on advocacy and caring, where you talked about the high cost of caring for others and how that can lead to burnout. And the leaders we often speak to on this podcast, they talk about the challenges of burnout and the impact of stress on their well-being. how can leaders balance caring for others with their own self-care?
That's a tough one, and I know we've had to Paul's point, a lot of change in terms of even the language that we're bringing into the work. And burnout is something that people have become more accustomed um, to name. And I think that the pandemic actually accelerated in a negative way. That sort of we've seen a lot of the burnout at the end of that too. And to me, there are almost sort of three pillars, three dimensions to care. So you have the caring for the mission that you sort of mentioned about some of the leaders, and then we have the care for others, and then the care for self is usually left last, and there's no room left, there's no capacity when you're using the capacity for the mission or for the goal and using your capacity for others. I'm just going to acknowledge the dogs. Can you hear them? Yes, I think they're just saying hello. I'm not sure it's a postman, but I'd rather than ignoring and pretending it's not there. It's they will. I'm sure they'll allow us to continue. But
Don't worry at all. Don't worry at all. Dogs are
and
very welcome.
thank you.
They're
Thank
just
you.
showing their caring side, aren't they?
Yeah,
That's
they are.
true.
They are.
That's
sitting
so
on
true.
they're listening to the conversation, and they're
That's
going,
true.
"Oh, here I am."
I think they're just they're agreeing. That's what I'm choosing to believe. They're sort of agreeing with what we're saying, and caring for dogs. I mean, there are many other alternatives and sort of people and goals and missions to care for. And I think it's caring for self. It hasn't been, certainly in the workplace, in the corporate, traditional, conventional way of doing things, caring for self, it's the last thing. You never talk about that. I work with financial institutions, very much that's sort of my audience, and they are expected to, or they used to, work 24/7. It's just, and work weekends. It's not even questioned, or cancel their holidays if they're in the middle of a deal or a deal just comes through the door. And it's not questioning. It's just the way it is, or the way it used to be. So I think to bring this new dimension of you also need to look after yourself. It's quite pioneering in a way in the last few years. And actually, it's interesting. I just listened to Arianna Huffington's podcast at the weekend on the Diary of the CEO. And I think the question to her was, what is, if you had one advice for leaders, what would that be? And that's what she said: oxygen mask first on you. She was talking to founders, and because the reality is, I mean, she had the ultimate where she collapsed. That's her story. But, you don't want to get to that point where you neglect your self-care to such an extent that you will pay a really steep price. So yes, finding a balance. And I think there's a lot more encouragement. The workplaces now have got programs, they've got mental health, they've got well-being, they've got, welfare. There's a lot more languaging around the importance of self-care and the importance of looking after self first, like we do it when we get on the planes, before we look after the team and we look after the family and everybody else. Still not easy. Talking from someone who's been addicted to serving others, and it hasn't been an easy path for me. This is still work in progress.
I think it's one of those things that people need to see examples from leadership, don't they?
Mm-hmm.
I remember a story, a story about a guy. I think I might have told this story on the podcast before, but I used to work for an accountancy firm, and it was the floor layout was almost, there were lifts at the front of the building, and then circular floors. So there were always two ways to get to the lifts. And I remember a story about a partner in one of the teams who was going through, had a young family, and it was the new experience for him having a new family. But at the end of the day, he'd walk the opposite way to the lifts rather than walk past his team, because he didn't want to show his team that he was leaving to go back and do whatever childcare it was that he had to do. And I remember him telling me this, and I said at the time, you need to walk the other way, because they need to see that that's okay. They need to be able to see that that's what you're doing, and tell them, leaving early because I've got to go back and do this. Nobody's doubting that you can do the job, or you will do the job in the time allowed. You've got to where you've got to. It's more important that you show everybody else that you're taking that care for yourself and for your family, so that they can see that that's okay. And I think you see it today, don't you? You see people saying, "Oh yeah, I'm just going to pop out for a walk," and people go, "Well, a walk in the afternoon," and that became absolutely normal during COVID times. And now it seems to be that people are drifting back to their 9 to 5. This is where I sit, and this is what I do, and it's a bit of a shame.
It is a bit of a shame, and actually it's interesting. You just reminded me, Paul, because I have this. I do have a newsletter on LinkedIn which I committed to 2 years ago, and it's probably one of the things I'm most proud of. It's once a month, and it's called Audacious Leadership. And my motto is, the most effective role model, or the most effective leadership model is the role model. And it's how do you role model, something like this? Because you have to give permission to your team. I mean, some of this new generation, they're looking up and they're saying, what's the point of me wanting to become a partner in the accountancy firm? Because I don't want that life. I don't want to having to sneak out. It's like, and so they don't have the desire to become that partner. So there is no, when you want to motivate your team, you need to also give them, as you said, this the permission, the example, the role modeling that they could actually aspire to, for sure.
Yeah, that's so true, especially in that world, especially in that world at the moment, because it's really it's a really tricky time for that profession at the moment in terms of succession and talent in the market and all those sorts of things. So it's really, really important that you make that step up to that level as attractive as possible. I completely agree.
Yes, and I think it is counterintuitive for the conventional leadership or the leaders, as you said, because we've been so used to the 9 to 5 and the structure and showing up, and so for them to embrace this new way, it's not easy, and it's also this idea of soft skills, which are really not soft. They're one of the hardest skills to acquire, and they pay off in the long term. But you just have to go through some of that pain in the short term.
Yeah, I like that idea. Yeah, you're absolutely right. The soft skills are the hardest to acquire. Absolutely. Yeah. I'm going to write that one down on a post-it and use it later.
Yeah, smart skills. I've seen it someone, because they're not genuinely. I mean, we're still using, talking about language, how we use language. Language is power. Language is energy, because it's the way we use it. And so if we keep saying these are soft skills, of course, they are going to be seen as such, and nobody's going to take them seriously. They're just soft.
Yeah, and your second chapter is essentially, I know it's got an A, but it's this emotional intelligence, isn't it? And I wrote down, one of the things I wrote down as I was reading that chapter was within that world, within the profession of accountancy and law, those sorts of things, the people at the top of the organization, and generally the partners, have absolutely unbelievable in their chosen field, and that's why they've risen to that level. It doesn't necessarily always equate to them being the most intelligent, emotionally intelligent people on the planet, as I'm sure you've seen in your past career. So that is a real challenge for that type of organization, the partner level, director level, when you're proven in your profession. But then the next bit is, how do you then lead a team forwards? How do you show that leadership? And I think that's probably one of the hardest things for them, is that emotional intelligence.
Totally. And actually, you brought you brought this emotional intelligence as a topic, and I do a lot of work with emotional intelligence. And I used to be an accountant, of course, in the most conventional way, and I use data. So for me, I show the data to them, to the partners, and say, emotions are data. That's what it is. So, and it's proven, and there is science behind it, and you can't make a decision. We think we make a decision with logic. It's not true. You make the decision with the emotion. And logic comes after. So when you look at the data, you realize that actually there is you can make a lot of business cases. You can make definitely the business case in using and nurturing and teaching and learning, the whole emotional intelligence. That's why it's an intelligence. And if we don't access it, we lose, we leave a lot on the table, interestingly.
The emotional intelligence is the attunement section. So it does have its A.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it's a bit more than that. You're right. There's a story to that. I didn't want to digress, but that was the last chapter. It wasn't meant to be. I was telling, I think someone else, is I had 7 A's originally, and then my editor said you should have another A, attunement, which is going to be all about emotional intelligence, because this is what I was practicing. That's what I do in my day-to-day job. And it was a difficult one to write, I have to say, because actually expressing and putting the feeling on a piece of paper, it was a challenge for me. But I'm glad she dared me for that, because it became a star as well with the eight A's. So thank you for that, for the reminder.
And speaking of those 8 A's, Alina, if there's one thing that leaders should do after reading this book, what should that be? What's the first thing they should do?
God, that's a tough one, Zoe, because it's like, they will very much depend on each and every one of the leaders. But what I will say, if they were to read that book, I would say, definitely do the quiz, as an action. So there is a last chapter, interestingly, which is called Actualization, which is Audacity in action, because action is everything. We can talk about this. It's nice to have a chat, but unless we go into action, unless we make that first step, it will just remain a nice conversation, as always. And sort of be prepared for 2 steps forward and 1 step backwards, because that's what life is. It's truly a dance. And I would say, if I had to, one thing that maybe anybody could do is to say thank you to someone daily, one person. And you will see, I promise you, just going and choosing a different person every day to go and say thank you, it will transform, it will change your life. I don't think we do it enough, and you can't, there are not enough thank yous in this world. We can say a lot more. So maybe that's what I would invite anybody. It would apply to anybody, because that's one of my definitely my favorite chapter, this sort of appreciation. And maybe another one actually, is I can never really go one. Breathe. As when we started this, we were all talking about what's happening in our own lives, in each and every one of us, and we forget to breathe. And I know this is such a simple statement to make. Breathing is the most efficient and useful tool on the planet, and the least used. Incredible. Because when we're under stress, what do? We just literally forget to breathe. So stop for 20 seconds wherever you are. And I used to say to people, just go, even, before an important meeting or anything like that, just go to a place, hide away, and breathe for 20 seconds.
That's great advice. Thank you. Stop and breathe, and also say thank you and take those first steps in terms of actions. Alina, thank you so much. We've loved reading this book and we've loved talking to you about it. And we're very excited to see where you go next with your amazing work. So we'd love to keep in touch. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much to Alina and her publishers, Profile Books, for making the time to come on to Starts at the Top and talk to us about the Audacity Spectrum.
Yes, huge thanks to Alina, and best of luck with the book. We will share links to the book and Alina's website in the show notes.
As always, we really do appreciate that you've listened all the way through to the end of the episode. Thank you, and thank you for bearing with me. In particular, you can support the podcast by leaving us a 5-star review wherever you listen to us. It really does help us to reach more people. So if you've enjoyed what you've heard, do share us with a friend.
Thank you so much for listening today, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks with a brand new episode of Starts at the Top.
See you then, and bye for now.